Welcome, everybody. Hopefully this is on. Thank you so much for joining us. This is really exciting, not only because we're celebrating John's latest novel, but also you have the honor of being our first in-person book launch since before the pandemic. So thank you all so much for joining us. Another first is that we are also recording and live streaming this. So thank you to those who are joining us on Facebook from wherever you are in the world. There will also be a recording of this available on the Muse Facebook page afterwards, if anyone has missed it or if any of y'all in person want to rewatch. But in the meantime, got a few housekeeping things to go through. For those of you who are in person, ignore the buzzing speaker. It does that sometimes. And also, exits are out here in the back and the way you came in the front. If you're on Facebook, your exit is probably in the top right of your screen. It looks like a little X. Let's see. If you happen to find a bookmark on your seat, take a peek at that. It's free, you can just have it. And there's also a little bit of information about the Muse and a QR code that will take you to our website. Hopefully you're all somewhat familiar, but if you're not, we're the Muse Writers Center. We are a literary center, creative writing nonprofit. We're located here in Norfolk, Virginia, if you're watching with zero context on Facebook. And we are lucky enough to have been able to kind of land on our feet over the pandemic, so we're now able to serve a really broad swath of the community. I personally teach some of our youth classes. I've had kids Zoom in from Manchester and from Australia, which has been really lovely. But also, our summer class schedule is out. If you go to the-muse.org, look on your bookmarks, it's there. But all of our classes are either in person for the first time since before the pandemic, yay, or virtual as well, and hybrid, which means you can attend either in person and the teacher will be in person in one of our hybrid classrooms, or you can Zoom in. Depends on how you're feeling on the day. So definitely check that out. All of our youth classes are free this summer. So if you have any creative teens or kids from 9 to 11 in your life who are interested in writing, send them our way. And we have summer camps as well. It's all on our website, so please check it out. I will stop putting off what everyone is here for, and I'll hand things over to Mike Krentz, who is a wonderful novelist and Muse teacher as well. He's going to introduce John Cameron.
Okay. Well, thank you, Susan. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce a man who I think most of the people in the room already know. So when I refer to him as a child of the Enlightenment, you know who I'm talking about. I first met John Cameron about 3 years ago at a Muse studio in this very building. It was Kelly Sokol's studio for advanced fiction writers. And he was at the time working on a novel about Sally Hemings, whom some of you might know was associated with Thomas Jefferson. And I made the egregious error of offering a totally ignorant comment, not about the quality of his writing, but about the historical accuracy of what he was portraying. And John, in his absolutely impeccable Southern gentleman style, very quietly, very nicely, with just a hint of erudition, told me I didn't know what the heck I was talking about. And he was right. He was definitely right. Anyway, most of you know John, but there's some background here that is important. He's originally from North Carolina, from the Sandy Hills. He's pretty much been all over the world since then. He got his degree in history at Davison College, where he says he also learned to play bridge, which nearly wrecked his college career. I can relate. That almost ruined my medical career too. And then he went to UNC Chapel Hill, where he specialized in 18th century France Revolution, Marseille and Provence. He's lived in France. He's been in the U.S. Army. He's been all over the world. Truly a child of the Enlightenment. Oh, wait a minute. We all know what the Enlightenment was, right? Not being a student of history, I looked it up. And here's what I came up with. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, was an intellectual and cultural movement in the 18th century that emphasized reason over superstition and science over blind faith. There were three main factors of the Enlightenment period, and those were reason, individualism, and skepticism. John, you know yourself very well when you call yourself a child of the Enlightenment. So The Roads of War, which I've had the privilege of reading an advanced copy, is a fantastic story. It immediately reminded me of Gone with the Wind. You're not going to find Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler in there, but John's writing is so close to the earth that he puts you in the scene and you are right there with these very real, raw, flawed characters. And you live this tremendous change that took place in our country in the early phases of the Civil War, right there along with them. And you are in the scene and you're in those characters. And it's raw sometimes, very realistic. And at the end, you say, that can't be the last page. I want to read more from this fantastic author. Oh, and by the way, that Sally Hemings novel that he was working on when I met him 3 years ago in Kelly's studio, that's going to be published, we hope around Christmas. So we're going to read that, get to read that very, very important piece of historical fiction that is so well done. I can't wait to see it get out in the world. So John, congratulations. Everybody who's here, thank you for being here. Don't forget to pick up your signed copy, and please, reviews are the lifeblood of an author. Amazon, Goodreads, wherever you can leave a review of John's book, please do. He's earned it. He's really earned it. John, over to you.
Kelly, you want to say anything now, or you want to wait until later?
Oh, it's up to you. I'd love to brag on you for a second.
Sure.
Okay, so this is Kelly Sokol, who was the new studio instructor that introduced the two of us.
John, it's the coolest experience to get to, again, brag on a student and a colleague and a friend and just a downright incredible human being and an even better writer. As you guys, if you haven't read John's books yet, you will discover that John creates characters in a world that will stick with you. We talked about this novel when I read an earlier draft of it several years ago, and as soon as he talked about it again, I said, oh my gosh, I remember this moment where a man sees a woman down by a stream, and it just is as clear as the first time I read it. And his characters are compelling. They will keep you up at night in the best possible way. And something else that is absolutely tremendous about John Cameron is that he is prolific. One day he could be writing in the Civil War South. The next could be a murder mystery in 19th century France. You just never know where you're going to go in his world and in his brain. And that's truly a gift, and it's very rare. And every time I read something from John, I learn something and I enjoy myself while I'm reading it and while I'm learning. And he is a gifted writer. He's a gifted reader of his peers' work, and a truly, truly generous human being and a creative spirit. So I won't stand up here and hog this mic any longer, but I'm thrilled for you, my friend, and come up and dazzle us with your words. Thank you so much.
I'm going to try to use this other mic.
Maybe I want.
Okay. So, just a couple of things before I read some to you. If you don't mind, I'll sit down. First of all, many of you know I've had a few health problems. This has nothing to do with that. This is purely ornamental. So don't look at this bandage and panic and think, oh my God, what's happened here. It's definitely, but definitely a quick thank you for the Muse. I mean, this place is, if I could write a novel, it's because of the Muse. It's absolutely true. And if any of you who have not been here, but you have any thoughts of writing, anything, it doesn't matter what, this is the place to come. You will get help, and you will end up writing something worthwhile. Absolutely. I'll mention this again, but before you leave, we have lots of food, so don't go rushing off. And after I read and any questions, I'll be out signing books. What I'm going to read for you is part of chapter 1. And I say part because I've eliminated a few passages so it will flow, and I won't have you here until midnight or something. The setting is Central North Carolina, 2nd of January, 1862, just after dawn. Lewis McCormack picked up the old horseshoe lying next to the water trough and smashed the thick ice so that the animals could drink. With each swing of his arm, he grew angrier. Where the devil is Henry? He should have been out here before dawn, lazy as hell. And Eliza, what in the name of God is wrong with that woman? Lewis had planned for his last night at home to be one of love and sweetness. But Eliza started in on him as soon as the children were out of the room. You've done enough. Let the others take a turn. 35-year-old man ought to be home. Let young ones with no family go. Damn it, I signed up for 12 months, not 5 months. And a man's age don't matter. We all got to do our part. I'm not the only one this old. Flynn Farrington's 36. Well, that don't matter to me. You could pay a substitute to finish them 12 months. Then do your part. You must like being down there. You'll never be back. The Yankees will kill you. Your children will be orphans, and I don't think you care. God damn it, Eliza. We've been over this all before. Lewis struggled not to yell. You know I gotta go back. Leave it alone. Damn you, just leave it alone. Eliza glared at him silently. When they went to bed 30 minutes later, she lay as far to her side as she could manage. Well, be damned then, he thought. I'll find some in Wilmington when I get back down there. Even as he thought it, he knew he'd never do that. But damn the woman. Why did she have to be this way? He remembered the first time he left for the war. Eliza had wept and shouted at him, but that night she pulled him inside herself like she would never let him go. And now this time, she was as cold as the wind outside on that 1st of January. Standing next to the water trough the next morning, Lewis realized he had smashed the ice into small pieces. Get on with it, he thought. There's a lot to do here. And I got to be at Swan Station before that train comes from Egypt. Where the hell is Henry? Lazy, worthless man. Ought to take a whip to him. Lewis shook his head. He had never taken a whip to Henry and never would, any more than he would find a whore in Wilmington. He had no use for a man who would whip his slave or one who would pay for sex. But both sure were tempting and good to think about. You'd have to go bang on the door of Henry's cabin. As he turned that way, he saw Henry come out his door. Henry walked slowly across the yard, slapping his hands together for warmth and scattering the chickens, ducks, and guinea hens already hunting for insects and seeds. Morning, sir. Morning, Henry. Get going. We need to be ahead on that wagon rolling in an hour. When you get the critters fed and Mo hitched, come on to the kitchen and get a cup of coffee. Lewis stepped around the barn to the outhouse. Damn, that plank was cold. He hurried back to the house, straight to the kitchen and some warmth. Eliza didn't look at him or say a word. Well, I'll keep my mouth shut too, Lewis thought. The fireplace was blazing, and Lewis could smell sausage and biscuits cooking. Best of all, he smelled coffee. Real coffee. Not that damn burnt wheat that passed for coffee nowadays. He had brought 6 pounds of beans with him 10 days earlier, paid 4 times what it should have cost, but he bought it, wanted Eliza to have some. As he sipped the coffee, he considered giving Eliza a hug to break the ice. But before he decided, she put a plate in front of him, piled with sausage, biscuits, and grits. She turned away without a word. So be it, he thought. He reached for the molasses pot and poured a puddle on top of one of the biscuits. Just as he sopped up the last of the molasses with the last biscuit, Henry came in. Eliza handed him a mug of coffee and 2 biscuits. Now Lewis couldn't say anything to Eliza. Wouldn't do for Henry to see them fight. Henry, bring Mo on up here to the house. You got my coupon box on the wagon? Yes, sir, both in the back. Henry made no motion to leave. It was cold outside. Go on then, we got to get moving. Henry set his mug on the table, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and went out. Before Lewis could speak, Eliza called out, "Children, come in here and tell Pap goodbye." She still had not looked at Lewis. Children must have been awake under the covers, for both were in the kitchen within seconds. Each gave their father a hug, said bye, and turned towards the fireplace for food and warmth. Through the window, Lewis could see Henry in the wagon. He put on his greatcoat, picked up his bag, and turned to Eliza. She stood next to the door, tears streaming down her face. She embraced him and whispered, "May God protect you. I can't live without you." Lewis walked directly to the wagon, 3 geese honking at him. He paid no attention to the geese or the 2 dogs who jumped up. He said nothing to Henry, just sat on the plank and pulled his coat tight. He was afraid if he opened his mouth, he'd cry like Eliza. That would not do. Henry gave a click with his tongue and a light flick of the reins. Mo started walking out of the barnyard, 300 yards alongside a field, and onto the sandy road that led southeast towards the railroad. All of Lewis's anger and sadness at leaving coalesced like iron shavings to a magnet round those plodding mule steps. This goddamn mule is too old and too slow. I think I'll sell him and get a young one. Henry didn't bother to respond. He had heard Lewis say that before. Mo was 12 years old, but had always been slow. He was also one of the ugliest mules alive. Short, scrawny with patchy black hair, slightly sway-backed with a thin tail. But unlike most mules, he was gentle and patient, never known to kick, bite, or buck if a child rode him. He never protested when hitched to the single tree pulling the wagon or plow. Truth was, Lewis would no more sell Mo than he'd sell Henry. Neither Lewis nor Henry had much to say for the first part of the trip. They were caught up in thinking about other times they had traveled the same road, past the dead white oak that marked the corner of a field belonging to Lewis' friend Flynn Farrington. While both had traveled the same road, they had very different memories of it. Henry had followed the road many times, both with Mr. McCormack and alone after dark when white folks wouldn't notice. There was a woman on the Swan plantation he liked to play around with. Mostly, though, his good friend Ajax was there. From Ajax, who could read, Henry learned about the world outside of Moore County. He heard about a man named Lincoln who talked about ending slavery. That railroad just might be a road to freedom. By early 1861, the railroad had been completed from Fayetteville to the edge of Moore County where Swan's land was, and the first real train was scheduled. Lewis brought his whole family to see the railroad in that first train. Eliza, the 2 children, even his 3 slaves, Henry, Nellie, and Harry. The world was full of hope. Moore County had voted in February, only 11 months earlier, 10-1, that North Carolina should not secede from the Union. Statewide vote was closer, but still firmly against secession. A half year after that first train at the end of September, Lewis returned to Swan Station along with 74 other men who had volunteered for the new North Carolina Army, to repel what the governor called an invasion by the United States. Try as he might, Lewis still didn't understand how it happened. How had the same men so opposed to secession become so eager a half-year later to fight against the United States? He had a feeling that trickery had been involved. Whatever the reason, the men had traveled on the train from Fayetteville and then by riverboat to Wilmington, where colonels and captains tried to turn a bunch of farmers into soldiers who hated the United States. Eliza had wept and pleaded that day in September. She begged him not to volunteer. But a man had to protect his family and his land. The thought of strange men putting hands on Eliza or his daughter put Lewis into a panic. Alice Ann was 15 and as pretty as her mother had been at that age, so he felt he had to go. And no amount of tears could hold him back. A man who didn't protect his women and his land was no man. So he left Moore County that September day for 12 months of service. Now here he was a third time on that road. Corporal, heading back to camp and to war. He was jarred out of his thoughts when Moe and the wagon forded the creek and walked up on the sandy ridge that ran all the rest of the way to the Swan Depot. Lewis looked at Henry and said, it don't help none that it's so cold. I'd have been warmer if I'd walked. Well, I suspect you would have, but then how you gonna get your stuff to the train? If old Moe go a little quicker, we could at least get where it's warmer. Lewis nodded. In the back of the wagon was a box with 24 eggs, along with 2 pair of wool socks, a comforter, 3 loaves of bread, 1 ham, and 5 pounds of sausage. There was also a coop with 6 pullets clucking softly inside. He would eat well at least for a couple of weeks. When the wagon reached the last curve in the road before their destination, Lewis could see smoke rising above the trees. Another 30 yards, and there was the building. Word was out that Swan was building a cotton gin. Everything that man touched seemed to turn to gold. Lewis didn't envy Swan's money, but it did rankle that Swan was home making more money while he was in the Army defending Moore County. Maybe I'll present that bill someday, he thought, but not just yet. Mr. Swan's man, Ajax, moved the box and the coop from the wagon to the platform and said to Lewis, I reckon you're going to eat pretty good down there, Mr. McCormack. I sure hope so, Ajax, if I don't freeze first. Lewis turned to Henry. Henry, come in with me and warm up a bit before you go back. No, sir, I got to get back. Miss Eliza might need me, but a little whiskey to warm the trip would be mighty welcome. While Lewis was in the store, Henry and Ajax caught up on the news. They were friends, but seldom saw each other, much less had a chance to talk. Some white folks didn't like to see black men talking together too much. Ajax, you good? What you hear about things? Henry, I'm as good as you could expect. News is the Yankees is about to invade Carolina from the ocean. Seems to me, with all the white men gone, we ought to organize ourselves a bit. Things get hot enough down yonder. Might be a chance for us to change things up here. Mm-hmm. I think so too. You let me know what you want to do. Short time, Lewis returned with a dipper half full of whiskey, which Henry welcomed. He was cold to his bones, but he wished he had had a few more minutes with Ajax. Sometimes Ajax could be a little quick and angry. He needed to be careful. Thank you, sir. He tipped up the dipper and slowly drank, savoring every drop. Now that warmed up my innards at least. Henry handed the dipper back to Lewis, climbed up on the wagon, pulled on the reins, turned Moe back onto the small road, and began the slow trip back home. Lewis watched the shrinking wagon and Henry for a moment, then climbed back up the steps into the store. The building was 30 feet long and 12 feet wide. The floor was unpainted, heart pine boards nearly a foot wide. On one side were shelves and a counter that held bolts of cloth, threads, pots, crackers, and sundry other items of interest to women. On the opposite side, there were 2 windows, a table for railroad business, and a second counter with cups, some dippers and bottles and barrels of whiskey. Lewis bought himself a 5-cent glass of whiskey and moved close to the Franklin stove in the far end of the room. It was a tricky balance to get close enough to the stove and away from the chill, but not so close that it was uncomfortable. Lewis looked at the clock that sat on the counter. 1 hour and a half before noon, when the train was scheduled to arrive from Egypt in the coal mine. His 3 recruits were to meet him by 11 o'clock. If he went back without those men, Captain McNeil would make his life miserable. Half an hour later, one of the 3, his cousin, Davey Morris, walked in. Morris lived 2 miles away and had walked fast to keep warm. Lewis relaxed some. He had worried that none of the 3 would show up. Thank God I finished that whiskey and put the glass back, Lewis thought. Last thing I need is for these boys to start drinking. Morris looked hungrily at the barrels as he crossed the room towards the stove. Lewis pretended he didn't see. No whiskey. Davey was a responsible man, even if a bit slow. Not that he was simple, but he was plodding. 25 years old, Davey was 5 feet 6 and strong, but tended to be sloppy in his appearance. He seldom remembered to trim his hair and would go several weeks between shaves. His fiancée had died of typhoid fever 2 years earlier, and he still mourned. In a way, he had nothing to keep him at home. Damn, Lewis, couldn't you arrange a warmer day for us to travel? I'm as cold as a well digger's ass. Get up close to the stove, that'll warm you up. I put in a requisition for a hot day, but the colonel had given them all out. This was the best I could do. Around 11 o'clock, the other 2 men arrived almost simultaneously. They were Eliza McCormack's relatives, but lazy, and in Lewis's opinion, little better than farmhands. Jordan Sloan was 19, a slender man, with hair so light it was almost white, and eyes as light blue as the sky. Tandy Strider was 18, tall with light brown hair and an open smile, a man people instinctively liked. Neither man had any interest in the Confederate cause. Their fathers owned no slaves, but did own enough land not to be considered trash. Joining up for 12 months seemed like an adventure and a chance to make some money. Lewis took charge at once. He had to have the men ready for the train, and he needed to keep them away from the whiskey. Boys, let's go pay Mr. Swan the 50 cents for the tickets so we can get right on that train for when that train from Fayetteville comes through. 3 looked at each other and then at Lewis. You gonna pay for the tickets, ain't you, Lewis? I ain't got any money. Jordan stammered out. You ain't got no money? Then how the hell do you think you're gonna get to Wilmington? How are you gonna eat on the way? What about you 2? Lewis looked at Davey and Tandy. Davey said, well, I reckon I could have chased down 50 cents, Lewis, but I didn't know I needed any money. Tandy replied with embarrassment. Lewis, we thought the company or the county was paying all that. You corporal, ain't you doing all this for the county? Damnation. Lewis had $24 in his purse. It was more than enough to pay his way back. However, he had promised Eliza to buy and send back enough salt for the year's meat. And that would take $10 given what was happening with prices. But there was no choice. He had to get those three boys to Wilmington, even if it took all his money. You boys got a lot to learn about the Army. A corporal don't get paid but $15 a month. Captain said get you, but he didn't give me no money. I'll loan you the money. You can pay me back when you get paid. Chances were not good of ever seeing his money again. Right on time at noon, train pulled up amid clouds of steam, smoke, and cinders. Mostly it was calling coal from the Egypt mine, but one passenger car had a few folks in it. The 4 men climbed up, gave their tickets to the official, and tried to get a seat as close to the stove as they could. Got to buy a copy to get the rest of it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. The words speak for themselves. What more can I say? There's food, there's books to be bought and signed in the back, and we're we're open for questions. If anybody has any questions they want to ask John before we break.
Were the names of the characters historical, or how did you come up with those?
Well, I grew up in this place, and the part of Lewis McCormack is based on letters I had from someone whose name was Lewis McLeod, and I didn't want to use the same name, but the names of the three enslaved people and his wife are the same. Most of the others I shifted a little bit around. Swan Station is a real place. There was a Mr. Swan who owned a big bunch of land and was a big planter, and truthfully made a fortune from everything that came through. So it's a little bit of, and the places are the same. The Egypt coal mine was developed as early as the Revolution in the next county for coal in North Carolina. So the place names are all very accurate.
What inspired you to write this particular novel?
Well, in part these letters that I read, and then I ended up doing a straight history, which came out last year from McFarland Press, on the regiment. I've got these people in the 30th North Carolina Regiment, and I did a straight historical study of the men of the regiment, not the battles in the war. It didn't interest me at all. But who were the men? How did they die? How much money did they have? How invested were they? What happened to them? And while I was at it, I said, no, it would also be fun to write it as a novel, wouldn't it? So I think I actually started the novel before I started the straight history, but that's the connection. Yes.
Right.
What's your process how do you approach the page when you're starting or revising this book? What's your process?
The process? Well, my process of writing, now editing and rewriting, as you know, is a very different matter. But my process of writing is to sit down with my pen and a pad of good paper with an idea or maybe a character. And as I said to Abby, to my wife sometime back, she said, where do you get all this stuff? I said, you dream it, you daydream it. I mean, writing a novel, and there's several novelists out here. To me, it's just daydreaming, and you write it down. You write it down. So that's my process. And then I try to go back and improve the daydream and then link together the pieces. Sometimes I'll end up writing the end first and pieces all together and then link them back together. I think everybody who writes a novel has a different process.
You mentioned rewriting. How much rewriting do you have to do?
I do a lot. Once in a while, I find I've written a short piece, a chapter that doesn't need very much, but there always are problems. When you're writing fast, and again, you're just dreaming it and writing it down, you go back through and you say, wait a minute, I need to say, what does the building look like? What does this character look like? What do they sound like? You got to make sense out of it, because if you looked at a first draft, you'd see where it was going, but you would have no clear sense of character, no clear sense of space. And I also, I'm an egregious speller. So there are lots of mistakes like this that I have to go back and catch up on. So I do a lot of rewriting.
You daydream all those details, or you go back and flesh them out?
I go back and flesh them out. So if I go to, say, these three guys who came in, the three recruits who came in, two of them have chapters in this novel that are really theirs. One of them I don't think gets mentioned again, but you need enough there so that you've got a picture of it. And it doesn't have to be much. So to me, saying that Jordan Sloan, which is, by the way, spelled Jordan, but nobody would have pronounced it that way. It was Jordan. So Jordan Sloan looks like a lot of my relatives, pale hair, pale blue eyes. And I said, okay, that's probably enough. You've got an image of this guy's face, at least in your mind, but all of that I have to go back and add. Yes?
So
do you have a favorite character in your book? Or how do you keep from having a favorite character? How do you keep the attachment to all of the characters?
Oh, that's an interesting question. A lot of writing is, people say it's autobiographical. It is and it isn't. Obviously, I never lived there. I never did these things, good and bad, that these men did. But their emotions and the way they see other people and relate to them, I think does come out of your own experience. So some of these people I like. There are a couple of characters in here who are really despicable. I don't like them at all. But again, that'll pop up later. Some of the other stuff I've read, I always joke that I've this series I've written on detective stories set in Marseille that Kelly mentioned. Well, the character there is really my alter ego. I mean, he just does things that would have been exciting for me to do. So that's easy to do. Yes.
Is it hard for you to write about the despicable characters?
Not really, because in a sense it's like acting, and I am at heart a ham actor and used to do a good deal of it. It's fun to act as an evil guy because you never want to do those things. You never want to believe that stuff. You're going to be more like the good guy, but the good guy can be a little boring. The bad guys are interesting. They're interesting. So they're fun to write about, actually. I mean, occasionally you write and say, wow, this is terrible, but still it's interesting and fun to write. Yes, Thomas.
Where do you get your historical, put things in historical context? So you have the letters that kind of builds, sort of character, but like the hardware, like buildings describing, I guess, architecture or roads or something like that. Or what's your source?
Much of this, some of the things came out of the letters, but much of it simply came out of growing up in that part of North Carolina. When I talk about the wagon going up on a ridge, and I actually left out a piece that's covered with longleaf pines that have been tapped for turpentine, I know exactly what that's like because I see it in my mind. I saw it when I was growing up. And I know what the fields look like, and I know what the houses look like. So some of this is simply out of my memory of childhood, and other things do come out of letters.
I hope somebody makes a series and more streaming services, option to Netflix or
Good.
or
I pay a nice commission if you're an agent.
see a really nice story.
You bet. I got a question.
Yes, Mike.
So I've had the privilege of reading the whole book, so I know Eliza is a great character, and Sally Hemings is a great character. Very, very well done. How does an old guy write women so well?
Well, let me quote somebody else on a different topic. This is, by the way, a very touchy question among writers, right? Especially of the literary sort, at the universities. And I think Mike find ourselves on the side that said, if you're a good novelist, you write about anything. And years ago, I don't know if any of you know the great Western swing band, Asleep at the Wheel. Well, the guy, I forget now the guy's name. He's got a standard name that he picked up when he moved to Austin years ago. 6'6", he wears cowboy boots. You'd swear he grew up there his whole life. He didn't. His real name was like Schliebowitz, and he grew up in Philadelphia. He was a good Jewish boy, in fact, grew up there. And I remember him being asked once on NPR, they had a new album out, and they said, they didn't say a good Jewish boy from Philadelphia. They said, but how does somebody who's not from there, how do you play this Western swing music? He paused a second. He said, you got ears you can hear, can't you? Well, it seems to me, if you can put yourself inside of one person's head, you can put yourself inside of somebody else's head. And certainly men and women don't think exactly alike. We just don't. An enslaved person's not going to think like a free person. But I'm fully convinced that if you really put yourself there, you can do it. And I've read many, many writers who have done so, women who've written about men, men who write about women. So this is a topic on which I am adamantly unbending. But many editors, as Mike knows, wouldn't even read my Sally Hemings book. They wouldn't even read it. You know, it's really a white guy writing about a black woman. No, I won't even read it. So their loss.
Yep. Very well done.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Yes.
John, did anyone at Davidson convince you to do something besides play bridge and maybe start writing?
It did. It taught me to like history. You know, I was a history major there, and I still have some very vivid memories of a few of the classes, especially Chip is another Davidson graduate, just 1 year too late for me to have known each other there. But Dr. McGahey's ancient history, which everybody called McGeechee because that's the way it's spelled, but it's a good Scottish name, and despite the fact that it looks like McGeechee, it's actually McGahey. But so yeah, I did pick up that. And some other good things too. Wasn't just bridge.
So how pivotal was North Carolina for the Civil War?
Extremely. Let me turn historian for 90 seconds. All right. North Carolina was extremely reluctant to secede. The first vote was a firm no, not even to consider seceding. And then after Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops, the governor and the legislature pulled a fast one on the population and simply declared a constitutional convention. You're not going to elect them, you're not going to approve it, you choose them, voted it, and declared that it would not be ratified by the people. And the next day they withdrew and started confiscating federal property, which put them into a state of rebellion. The population was never wholeheartedly behind it. There were whole counties, and not just in the mountains, but in the Piedmont midsection, who formed units to resist conscription and refused to join the Confederate Army. Extremely high desertion rate of those who were dragged in. And in 63 and early 64, there was a peace movement that looked for a while as if the state might withdraw from the Confederacy. North Carolina had, you know the numbers, maybe an eighth or so of the population and furnished a quarter of the troops of the Confederacy. A quarter of the troops came from North Carolina. So it's very much, and to try to display that in a novel without looking ridiculous was not easy for me. I hope I've done so. But once you're in, especially as a soldier, and I know there are some former soldiers out here, that notion of the band of brothers, you don't leave. You stick with them, regardless of what you think of the cause. You stick with them. Does that help?
No, definitely. Were there a lot of blacks that fought for the Confederacy?
No. The simple answer is none did. But I don't think it's an open and shut case. I found in this regiment I studied 5 men who were listed as men of color in the census. Now, if those are the only 5, then I'm going to say no, they probably were not black, they probably were Indian, they probably were Native American, there was something else. But I don't think it's a closed case. Picture this way, there were no slaves who joined. That's a given. If you're a free person of color, and you've been that way since the Revolution or early 18th century, you own land, you're here with your neighbors who are mostly white, you want to be accepted by them. You want to be part of that structure and have them value your freedom and see you as their equal. So I don't find it unreasonable that some of these men would have volunteered. But it's very much an open question. But most historians will just tell you flatly, no, there were none.
Okay, I think
Thank you.
there's food to be had, there's
Food,
books to be
drink,
bought,
and I'm gonna go
books to
sign
be read and
books.
signed, reviews to be left. So let's move forward.
Thank you
John
so
will be
much.
available.
Thank you.